Thank you so much for the invitation to join you here today. I'm speaking from Pembrokeshire in West Wales, and I'm being battered by by winds of up to 60 miles an hour. So every now and then they get really loud. So hopefully that's not going to translate into our presentation. Yeah, we really appreciate the chance to talk about the final findings today. We came to Hawkwood and had a really interesting session with people while we were developing our thoughts. And so I'm just going to canter initially through the sort of what we've done and how we've done it in terms of the overarching piece of work. And then Stan, who was both the secretariat to the whole group, but very specifically the secretariat in the context of the food group, and therefore has been involved all the way through that. He will then take over and talk through with you some of the key findings in that space. So first, I'm just going to say a little bit about the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. People can look it up. So, and it may be, and I've recognized in some names on the call that people will have heard me talk about it before, but it's really important in the sense that it is the permission to think differently in Wales. It allows us to say, and this is very relevant in terms of the brilliant presentation that Jonathan just made, it allows us to actually think about the same kind of things as Schumacher talked about. In the context of looking at all aspects when we make decisions, so that we're not thinking about just delivering industrial amounts of food in industrial ways that are negative in the context of the planet, but how we can be prosperous and low carbon, how we can be resilient in terms of nature, how we can be healthier, how we can be more equal, how we can create more cohesive communities, how we can make sure that this doesn't in any way damage our culture or language, and how in anything we do in Wales, we are as globally responsible with what we do externally as we are in the context of our own country. And a very clear example of that would not be exporting our emissions. So the Act provides a great values framework. And although I was the one who proposed it, I'm not the one who took it through all the sort of committee stages, etc. So this is very much an act that is being created both by those of us who called for it, but very explicitly the last Parliament in terms of taking it forward. And I think it's one aspect that is also very important is these goals, which are linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, are on the face of the Act, but also on the face of the Act are 5 ways of working. All public organisations, including the Welsh Government, have to think long-term, be preventative, to collaborate, to integrate, and involve people about who decisions are being made. And we determined to use these mechanisms in terms of the way that we conducted our work. Next slide, please. So the goals, just for people to be aware, because there's a consequence to this, are linked to the Sustainable Development Goals, and they are on the face of the Act. And interestingly, in the context of what we're going to talk about, if you look at the top of the definition of a prosperous Wales, for example, it's innovative, productive and low carbon, which recognises the limits of the global environment. So not only is this unique legislation in Wales, but it uniquely recognises the limits of the global environment. Next slide, please. And our explicit mandate was this one. We were asked by both the Welsh Government and Plaid Cymru, one of the opposition parties, to deliver independent advice on pathways. And that's key because there are thousands of recommendations that go to government. And as minister, I said in 1 week, I had about 3,000 recommendations. It's impossible for ministers to deal with that. And so I was determined as an ex-minister not to add to the recommendations, but add to the solutions. How can we create the kind of pathways that could be delivered by government that are you know, that government can be confident in what we give them is the most up-to-date pathway approach and is academically underpinned. Next slide, please. And so that academic underpinning for me is key. It was great to see Jonathan asking questions about what is science. And this is the sort of question about what is evidence. But it was very, very important, I think, particularly in a world where we are likely to see and have seen most enormous amounts of misinformation and disinformation just in the last week, that actually we hold to the idea that we can have an evidence base to our decision making. And so for me, it's always been very important that the decisions we make have good, solid academic underpinning. So independently, Welsh Government funded the Wales Centre for Public Policy at Cardiff University to write the 5 reports that underpinned some of the key focuses of the work we've done. So their reports, for example, on how Wales can feed itself by 2035, we then tested and challenged in the context of the work that we did in the sphere of the whole of the net zero portfolio. Next slide, please. So we've launched this in September of 2024. There was a very specific kind of deliberation about when we launched it, because it's an everything connected approach. So 7 reports, but we do encourage everybody, because we've deliberately written them in as sort of short and we hope publicly friendly way as possible. The 7 reports make up a whole in terms of the delivery of pathways to a prosperous, i.e. low carbon, innovative and within environmental limits, and resilient Wales. So this is very much about being nature positive and a just transition. So we have this kind of approach which has enabled us to give advice that might be used by the Climate Change Committee, and they're just about to produce their UK advice that might be used, well, we know is being used by the Welsh Government in the context of its budget that was agreed yesterday and will be signed off in March. And I've already had the privilege of talking to all the other governments, not only in the UK and Ireland, about this work, because everybody's interested in the idea of taking pathways forward. Next slide, please. And so how the pathways work is here. This is just an example. This happens to be from the education report, but we talk about which areas we're covering and why, because they need to be able to contribute to the just transition, to being nature positive, and to our fundamental proposition, which is, can Wales do these things by 2035? Can it accelerate climate action, the mitigation climate action? And we also have talked very much in our enablers report about risk and adaptation as well. And the answer is yes, it can, but in some cases it might be too interventionist. But we lay out what the pathways are, who has to be in delivering in the context of each aspect of each pathway. We lay out our opportunity, and we've done this in a really positive way. We've got a clear summary of pathway advice, and then we lay out why we did what we did, because we want all of this to be interrogated. If it's going to be useful, particularly in other countries and not just Wales, then people need to think about all those aspects. So I suppose, you know, as an ex-teacher, although I was an English teacher, not a maths teacher, it's a bit like we're showing our working. We're not just coming out with a sort of brand new set of ideas, but we want to show the working. And I'm really interested in the fact that, for example, the Tim Lang's report, which is very much moving in just in time to just in case, is a sort of classic example of a new way of looking at something that is absolutely tied to looking at this in the context of resilience, rather than looking at it in the context of abundance through industrial methods. So I think this new way of looking at things, which Stan will go to in more interest, is really important. Next slide. So our overarching headlines and are very positive and hopeful, and I was really pleased that Jonathan finished on that. Yes, it's a step change in ambition. Yes, it needs support from the UK government, But importantly, it needs the greater societal mandate for change. And I'll come back to that after Stan's presentation. But there are huge benefits to all of us if we take this approach. But in order to get the benefits, we need to act now and not keep waiting before we take action. We've known about the science for a long time, but we're only, in a sense, on the pivot moment of taking action. And that only planned transition can be a just transition, because otherwise it's going to be short-term responses from governments, whether that's local or national, to unintended, or other public sector organisations, to unintended shocks. Next slide, please. So this is the suite of reports designed for just and nature positive transition, bringing out co-benefits. How could Wales feed itself, enabling the transition? What could education, jobs and work look like? And next slide, please. And how could people and places be connected? How could Wales heat and build homes and workplaces? And how could Wales meet energy needs? And they're an interrelated package, but each report can also be read independently. Over to you, Stan.
Amazing. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Hawkwood colleagues and everyone for joining. I just have my slides up in front of me, so I'm speaking a bit into the void. So someone please shout to me if you can't hear me particularly well. So I'm going to whiz through the food report. I've got a couple of slides to sort of situate ourselves, explain a bit more the context, the background, and then I'm going to very rapidly canter through the substance. It's always a challenge to condense around 18 months of quite complex work into a presentation. So it's really just about giving you a flavour of the substance, hopefully stimulating a bit of discussion, and then I suppose thirdly enticing you to read the reports in their full detail, which they need. So I thought I'd start with why this work is important. There's so many reports out there, it's often hard to differentiate with, oh, here's another report. But a few quick reasons from me. One, this work is really novel in the sense that it's never been done in Wales. I think there's one other country in the world which has a net zero target in the 2030s, but no one in the UK and or Wales has ever looked at what could a net zero transition to 2035 look like. It's holistic in the sense that we approached the exploration of net zero through the lens of the Wellbeing Act. And as James already spoke to, one of the really important things for us and that we were really mandated to do was to look at the tensions and trade-offs as well as the co-benefits of an accelerated net zero transition with the connections to the social dimension, cultural, economic and environmental as well. Therefore, it's clearly some very ambitious work. We like to think as ourselves as radical, and we try to push the thinking as much as possible. One thing Jane's already spoke to in the context of looking at pathways is that to the extent possible, we really try to make this work as comprehensive as possible and touching on all the various interconnections of the food system and doing that to the greatest detail we possibly could with the sort of time and resources that we had at our disposal. And one thing that's really important to me, and I know Jane also, is that this work is a start. We don't have all of the answers and these things need to be worked through in the future. So we really like to see this work as a kind of new direction, if you like, for Welsh Government and Plaid Cymru and those that sort of want to learn the lessons from our work. So really quickly, I think it's important to describe sort of how we did this work as well as sort of what we produced. So as Jane spoke to, we're made up of sort of volunteer expert members. In the food group, we worked with a 10th generation farmer, people from academia, private sector and sort of finance sector as well as some quite prominent NGOs in Wales. And Jane's already spoken to the evidence review we had and what the Wales Centre for Public Policy provided us. We also had an open call for evidence, and we used the term evidence quite lightly and broadly, that anyone and everyone could supply their perspectives, the information they have at their disposal, and you don't have to be a kind of academic or scientific organization to provide evidence. We're also lucky enough to have a set of kind of further experts to sort of stress test our thinking and review it further. The participatory process is in blue because I think it's something that's really important in the context of the food work, in that we held a series of workshops with key stakeholders across the food system in Wales. And we did that from the beginning because we wanted to bring people together and start sort of depoliticize and detoxify some of the discussion in Wales. So what we did with those stakeholders was co-develop a vision together. And we also developed a partial pathway of action, which we then as a group built on. And I think we'd love to have worked with stakeholders more and have had a completely kind of co-productive process. But again, we had certain constraints. The Wellbeing Act, Jane's covered that, so I won't speak to that anymore. We also had a really important period of kind of engaging with stakeholders and testing our thinking kind of throughout the process, really. It was important to us that, as often feels with a lot of government work, there's often a sense it's developed in isolation. And we really wanted to do differently, basically, because it's not just about the output of our work, but the way we did it, which we kind of wanted to advise and demonstrate a different way to Welsh Government. A vision I've kind of already spoken to, but we kind of had this three-pronged approach if we wanted to speak to a really positive vision of what the future food system and Wales could look like, whilst also speaking to very clearly, I guess, the context of the moment and what the problems are and what is and isn't working. And then the last bit to that three-prong was us being very clear about the sort of risks of inaction, in that if action isn't taken, then this is what Wales and its food system might look like as a result of even further inertia. So why present this to you? I think it's always good when doing a presentation to kind of start with, well, what's the point in this? From my perspective, it gives a kind of new basis to hold government and relevant actors accountable to, in that we've tried to be really ambitious in speaking to what the possibilities are versus kind of what the problems right now are. A framework, I'd imagine I probably don't need to talk too much about the interconnected nature of the food system to you all, but that is a really important piece for us, which, whilst it sounds simplistic, it is quite hard for governments to grapple with. Insights in terms of our process and outcomes on where government policy is and where it could also be. Positivity we've already spoken to, but again, something that is really important. We don't dwell too much on the nature of the situation. We really try to look forward to not what's wrong now, but what the Wales and the world could look like. And I guess what I'd really like from you all today is challenge, healthy, constructive challenge on the substance of our reports and thinking contained within them. And then lastly, I guess could just call this support and your ideas and thoughts on where this work could go in the future. And I guess maybe even more importantly, how the insights could be used to support what you're doing and initiatives you're aware of in, I guess, context of ongoing action. Cool. So where we started, as the sort of diagram on the right indicates, and it's very non-exhaustive, the food system is highly complex and there is an awful lot to consider. And as I said, we co-developed a vision with our stakeholders as a bit of an anchor, because it's really important for us not just to look at net zero. We were mandated to look at how net zero and accelerating the reduction of greenhouse gases sort of interacts and relates with all the other societal, cultural, economic, and environmental objectives that we need to be delivering holistically. So yeah, just to really speak quickly to this vision, we had one thread around universal access to a healthy diet. Resilience and food security is a huge one. Seeing the climate crisis in tandem with sort of nature and biodiversity crisis. And lastly, sort of safeguarding communities and the food system we develop in Wales is one that will create prosperity across all parts of society in Wales. Cool. So I am going to canter very quickly through the substance of the reports, and our plan is sort of leave 15 minutes at the end for your questions. And the way I've broken this down is essentially as sort of key chapters that we kind of reduced the food system and all its complexity down into. The first one is titled "To Start with a Fundamental Shift in Welsh Policy," and this is to basically say to the politicians and people of Wales that unfortunately our food system is very broken at the moment, and the Welsh Government and relevant actors need to take a very fundamentally different approach to how we treat the importance of food policy in Wales. A few of the kind of key headlines that due to all of these kind of myriad challenges, dialogue around the food system in Wales, particularly net zero, has become very politicized and very toxic, and a lot of stakeholders have kind of become quite fragmented, and we're not working in a sort of integrated, collaborative kind of way. So that's a really big headline for us. There needs to be a fundamental shift in sort of spatial planning, and that's really about making sure that we are using our land marine environments in the best way possible so we can meet the multiple objectives for all of the societal, environmental, cultural, economic outcomes that we need from our land. And the last point there, it's a bit more of a kind of technical one, but because of the nature of agriculture, land, marine environments, a lot of different sectors, including agriculture, are thinking and will potentially need to use the mitigation potential of land marine environments to offset some of the ambition they can't reach. And there's kind of key point there that all sectors will need to shoot for the highest emissions reductions before we consider land-based offsets, and that those land-based offsets need to be considered sort of holistically across the economy. So to really quickly just speak to some of the advice that we provided. We're very lucky to have the Future Generations Commissioner in Wales. One of the sort of key pieces of policy advice was to more effectively integrate food into their work. Develop a land and marine use framework for Wales. So we're sure that we're using XYZ pieces of land in the most sort of effective manner. Producing food security reports we're not at the moment. And also thinking about developing a national food strategy, which is really an opportunity to start to bring together quite divergent stakeholders in a completely different manner at the moment, which is something that's been called for very widely from stakeholders across the food system in Wales. Next one is about finance, which is quite obvious in its importance. And some of our key headlines here when thinking about, I suppose, public subsidies in the land use sector in Wales is that land managers and farmers need long-term financial security to be able to make these fairly seismic transformative changes to their land and their practices. And the Welsh Government needs to work with UK government to be able to introduce a far longer term and far greater kind of agricultural support budget, which is basically something, if we're looking at net zero by 2035, needs to be 10 years. And there's also a bit more sort of specific advice on what the sustainable farming scheme in Wales could look like. The public purse is never going to be enough, so private finance is needed, but that does need to be very high in its integrity and needs to be consistent standards, and the Welsh Government needs to sort of lead that work rather. Another sort of slightly more technical point there is that yes, productivity and efficiency measures will be part of the puzzle. It wasn't something we focused on to a great extent because there's already a lot of work out there, but one of our key points back to decision makers in Wales was that they will be insufficient alone, and that we do need to look at what we farm as well as how we farm. And there's also this quite interesting rebound effect in terms of productivity and efficiency, which is a bit challenging in the context of a very rapid net zero by 2035 transition. So next one is about increasing public funds to enable a more sustainable, local and diverse food system. And as I said, one of the key messages from our group was that it's critically important that we change what we farm alongside how and where we farm. And in the simplest terms, this is about reducing the dominancy of livestock in Wales. and having more arable and horticulture farming in Wales. And to do that, we need to enable more, I guess, new and diverse opportunities for farming and agriculture in Wales. And in tandem, Welsh Government needs to do what it can with its own agency to support the development of more local markets. For example, public procurement being a really interesting tool that is very much at the disposal of Welsh Government. Within the sort of food system and nature of consumption in Wales, we also definitely recognise the challenges with the agency of Welsh Government to work with supermarkets, but and there will be a continued role with supermarkets, but the Welsh Government does have some agency to work with those rather large and sort of powerful actors. Also quite an interesting point there that horticulture or increased horticulture could actually increase emissions in Wales. But the view of the group was, given the sort of food security and resilience benefits and the potential public health benefits in the context of not producing a lot of fruit and veg in Wales at the moment, that could be worthwhile in terms of potentially increasing emissions. So some of the advice we provided back to Welsh Government was around introducing sustainable supply chain investment scheme in Wales for horticulture that would be consumed in the public sector, a dedicated horticulture and arable support scheme that sort of meets the demands of small horticulture and arable farmers, increasing local food processing and distribution networks in Wales, providing better capital support to horticulture, having an organic plan, which we don't in Wales, but I believe we used to. And lastly, not forgetting that, well, I guess for me, a lot of the conversation tends to stick to the land use sector, but there is also, particularly in Wales, a really interesting and significant role for increased diversification of what we use our marine resources for, whether that be for food or non-food products, which could help diversify, I guess, the agriculture sector of Wales, which is often unspoken to in net zero reports. So the next one is around addressing wider barriers that are inhibiting change for Welsh farming and fisheries. And for me, this is really important to us because a lot of the work on net zero I've done tends to get reduced to just where emissions can be decreased, and that was something we looked at in quite good detail. So thinking about international environmental welfare standards and how we can protect Welsh farming, thinking about some of the barriers for tenant farmers in Wales, thinking about access to land, particularly for new entrants, how we can increase and kind of scale up the model of county farms in Wales, which is already some really interesting examples. Improving supermarkets where possible. I would say that's probably an area I think we could have done a little bit more on in hindsight. Thinking about consumer information around the quality and also climate and environmental impacts of food. And lastly, thinking about how we can stimulate, I guess, the wider environmental sort of skills area, and how we can foster the development of skills and also kind of wider job creation in I guess you could say in nature-based solutions, if you like. And yeah, I probably won't go through this in too much detail, as hopefully you can see on the side some of the examples of the advice we gave back to Welsh Government. I'm slightly conscious of time, and it really does merit kind of reading all of this in its detail. So lastly is the chapter we called Revitalising our Food Culture and Addressing Health Inequalities in Wales to protect the, I guess, long-term viability of the NHS, which is also under significant pressure in Wales. And yeah, there's a lot of evidence out there that shows that reaching net zero will require changes to what we eat. And broadly, that dietary change looks like increasing consumption of coarse grains, legumes, fruit and veg, reducing meat consumption, particularly red meat, and little to no ultra-processed food. This is a very complex complex area. And at the same time as changing our consumption patterns in Wales, we don't want that to result in sort of increased exports and kind of no net change to our sort of food and farming system in Wales. And that's a really knotty area that, as Jane spoke to, a lot of our reports kind of interrelate with each other in the context of the food one to kind of combat some of that complexity. We've already spoken to, or I've already spoken to, the, I guess, necessity to financially reward farmers fairly and over the long term to stimulate the markets for those products and also protect against low international trade standards elsewhere. The last thing I'll probably say on this slide is that yes, food policy is part of this puzzle when it comes to sort of food cultures and health inequalities, but this needs to be grounded in a far deeper and more foundational, I guess, strategy around economic inequality and prosperity in Wales, so that people have greater capacity to produce food that is to consume food that typically will cost more. And that's also one of the reasons we looked at food culture, because it's not just a question of financial income, but also one of sort of some of the lost culture we have around food and the junk food cycle that we find ourselves trapped in. And we really lent on Henry Dibbleby's work in this area, which really majored on food culture and health inequalities. That was a very rapid canter through. I'll leave you with this vision for what Wales could look like in 2036, which was kindly written by Carwyn Graves for us, who's an author and a gardener in Wales and also an academic. I won't read it, but I'm just signposting it for you in the future, because I think it's a really positive vision of what Wales could look like in the future, should we and our politicians wish to embark on a slightly different direction when it comes to the food system. Jane, I'll hand back to you quickly.
Thank you so much, Stan. And I think I mean, there's a lot of material that you'll have seen in Stan's slides. And I think what has been really interesting is it's only in the last few years that anybody is taking food seriously in the context of the opportunity to make change. So as Stan said at the beginning, it's a starting point, but the food report, more than any other report in our suite of reports, contains an enormous amount of hopeful practice and also an enormous number of references so that people can check everything and everybody. I just wanted to kind of draw our little bit to a close. There was a very good piece in the publication, The Conversation, this morning, and if people don't read it, it's a fantastic publication. It's basically academics who write articles about things in the news, and this is by Anastasia Denisova, who is leads on journalism, and her particular interest is climate journalism and engaging with people at the University of Westminster. And she talks about how if you want to make climate conversations more effective, it's about giving people agency, it's about localizing the issues, it's about making stories relatable, it's about avoiding doomism, and it's about creating a new normal. And when I read that this morning, knowing we were going to do this today, it struck me that we are trying to do all of those things in this work. And now you see the slide from Wangari Maathai, who I was privileged to meet back in 2009 at the COP in Copenhagen. But it is about, you know, when is the time to shed our fear and give hope to each other? That time is now. So we have to believe that there are hopeful futures, and what our role, what is our agency? What does local look like? How can we tell the stories? How there's a lot of doomism around, so let's just avoid that. But actually, how can we create a new normal so that actually we're engaging people in a process of looking at ways in improving all our lives at the same time? Next slide. And I just think it's useful to know that irrespective of what is happening in politicians, there is some very solid evidence that is now starting to come through the insurance industries. This is the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, but actually some key bank reports as well. There was one out from JP Morgan last week that is absolutely telling us that governments do need to take action in terms of actually very positive ways forward. Next slide. And one of the most effective ways in, and I'll finish with this, is actually about looking at the effect on current and future generations. Because everybody has an oldest person they love and a youngest person they love. And in my case, my mum is in her 10th decade because she's going to be 95 this year, and my youngest granddaughter is 4. And if we think of lifespans of up to 100 years of lives well lived and lives protected, not in war, not in food loss or anything else, between them, with me in the middle, that spans 200 years. So we're not talking about something that's not relatable. We're talking about people we love being affected by not taking action. And so taking positive action makes us agents of change. And although we've yet to see how this will play out, the UN at its General Assembly in September last year adopted a resolution to have an envoy for future generations based on the Welsh model. And part of what that envoy is looking to do is create holistic approaches for the world to have envoys for future generations in their own country, potentially by 2028. So diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much.
Diolch, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane and Stan, for that conversation. I am going to open up the space for Julian Jones first, who has his hand raised.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Stan. And thank you especially, Jane, for how you finished off there in terms of not being gloomy about this. I put in the chat that, you know, really, I should explain, I'm an environmental engineer. So if someone comes to me with a job and says, oh, we want you to be resilient, to be blunt, I don't know what they're talking about. It's meaningless, utterly meaningless. So if I'm working on a flood project or a sewerage project, the client, not only I would expect, wants me to resolve the issue, there is a legal onus that is long-standing that would require me to do so. Now, I'll spell these legal criteria out, but yeah, I mean, just a few snapshots. Flooding, I worked for 5 years in the Slad Valley below Hawkwood by sponsoring postgraduate students, 12 of them doing dissertation and internships, to create the first natural flood management methodology. And we found we could easily capture all flood water and double or treble food production. And furthermore, we could do it for the cost of the scoping study that the Environment Agency had commissioned, which came up with completely the wrong solution. So huge wealth being obscured, aligning very nicely with your criteria of keeping it local, keeping the wealth local. Just one final snapshot, one of my projects in North Wales, Ogwen, 200 kilowatt turbine. The community in the first 2 years got £3 back for every pound they invested, and each of those pounds was multiplied 13 times over in the local economy. So we're actually on the brink of the most fantastic transformation for humanity. But we need to stop all this nonsense about resilience and demand resolution. Thank you.
Thanks, Julian. I mean, I couldn't agree more with you. And I think when I first became minister, I remember that the Pont Bryn flood management project was a very early contribution. And I spent the whole of my time as Minister for the Environment saying, well, where else can we do this in terms of natural flood management? And I think what's interesting now is that it's taken a while. We're in the 10th year of the Act, but all public sector organisations are required to think of these opportunities. And I think that having examples of good practice is actually incredibly important in terms of people feeling that they can copy. And one of the other premises for this piece of work, which neither of us have mentioned, is I said, I don't want to be a first mover on anything. So we didn't in this work, for example, as many people have done, say there can be an engineering solution to this. So we don't need to worry about it. You know, somebody will come along and give us an engineering solution. We wanted to be second movers, where we already had some evidence that meant that we could say, and here's an example of good practice. So I hope that when people read our reports and read examples of people doing things, all of this is about stubborn optimism and hope.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question or that interaction. I'm going to read out a question from Tom Herbert. From a Welsh public point of view, 1, what are the motivating drivers for the change this report perceives, and where do you see resistance? Where is it, and how do you approach it? And 2, where do you see meaningful, motivating change in light of this report?
Stan, do you want to start?
Yeah, 2 quick reflections on that. I mean, one would definitely be a lack of political will and ambition. Speaking as a 31-year-old, around the time of my birth, we were fairly aware of what this challenge was, and we've chosen to not act globally in the way we could have. And that has resulted in a set of problems that are far more difficult than they should be. And that kind of the low-lying fruit have largely been picked, and there's a lot of, well, it's basically this really challenging balancing act that politicians need to sort of play, where yes, there are trade-offs, and some of the means to mitigate some of those trade-offs are becoming increasingly difficult, and there's just a lot of inertia in the system as a result of that. That probably requires a lot more explanation, but given time, I'll skip on to my second point in terms of sort of barriers and challenges, and maybe let Jane come in on the rest of the question. That we've just framed climate action in completely the kind of wrong way, because there's this mantra in government of only working and managing with what you can measure. And there's reasons for that. The bottom line to addressing climate change is obviously greenhouse gas emissions in reducing the potential impacts of a changing climate. But we've forgotten about all the interconnections and intersections that climate change has with wider well-being, which for me is a huge pro and benefit of this work, that when we talk about climate change, it's not just this transparent gas in the atmosphere that is quite hard to understand for most people who don't have the time. And we really need to start talking about the benefits for income, job creation, food security, public health, etc. And that needs to be done in a far more relatable way. I'll pause there and let Jane come in on maybe some of the, I guess, opportunities there to the second part of the question.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, there isn't another piece of work like this anywhere. And the fact that it was commissioned by 2 political parties who between them represent 2/3 of the members in the Senedd, the fact that for every one of our reports we had total unanimity in terms of the outcome, even though particularly in the food area, the discussions sometimes were incredibly difficult. The fact that we were able, in the same way as we, as I've just talked about, the kind of way in which we should be talking about climate managed to get people with some very different views to have agreement on some core areas, I think should give us enormous amount of hope for the future. And I think the fact that the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister have both had presentations about this report. He described it as, I think it was something like exhilarating and terrifying, wasn't it, Dan? But they know that we've given them strong evidence as well in terms of how these pathways can be driven forward. So there were 2 points that we wanted to take forward subsequently. One is they need to interrogate this work, particularly because we published in September, we were in publication mode since last June, and therefore there may be other elements of evidence that can contribute to more updating by now. And I think the second really important point is that although everybody talks about nature-based solutions, one of the things we found through our work is they weren't readily available. So we didn't necessarily have the pathway to those solutions to slot conveniently into our work. So we have suggested in our report that there should be a separate piece of work that actually uses a similar approach, but actually everywhere that we've proposed nature-based solutions, that there should be a separate piece of work by those organizations which understand exactly what that means in practice, and commissioning advice from others to actually populate that. And the 2 reports together would give us the just transition and clear nature pathways as well. And I know that literally as we speak, there is a letter winging itself to the First Minister from all the nature-based organisations to ask for a mandate and some financial support to carry out that work. But as I was saying right at the beginning, we did this also to influence what the Climate Change Committee, the statutory advisor, says to the UK government in February, end of February, says to the devolved administrations in May. And so I think that some of the measures of our work will be whether or not it is referenced in that context because of the nature of the evidence base to it and the clear deliberation by international experts. Stan.
Yeah, sorry, there's just, if I can, one other point I want to make off the back of the latter bit of Tom's question around meaningful change. And for example, Tom is definitely one of these people that is doing like fascinatingly positive, helpful work, albeit not in Wales. And through my time working with the food group, I came across just a myriad number of incredible people and organizations that are basically filling the gaps of what government isn't doing. And by having Jane at the helm, one of the really important things to us, which I probably already touched on, is like we gave Welsh Government Plaid Cymru the what they can do, but the way we did the work and the how this work can be done very differently is really, really important. And Jane spoke to one of the points earlier around this sort of shift in kind of withholding power to start to kind of enable agency within sort of ecosystem stakeholders and people working the food system of Wales. And that is a really different mindset to what I've observed through working in different departments of government, that people and the public, irrespective of their level of agency or what they do, are often seen as just another cell on a cost-benefit analysis. Whereas really we need a different, completely different mindset that looks to try and harness and enable people to make change. And off the back of that, I've also seen quite a lot of very frustrated people within the food system of Wales that kind of have the mindset of, we're just going to do it ourselves now. And I think if government could start to become a little bit more comfortable with kind of working with uncertainty, and then shifting that mindset to wanting to develop agency within its public, we'd be in a completely different position. And that's one of the things that excites me and gives me a lot of active hope as to how the future could look quite different.
Thank you, Stan. We've got a question from Dimitri to Stan and Jane. I think you've touched on this, Stan, briefly, but he asks just a bit more specific. He says, given the challenges of defining what net zero actually is, for example, territorial emissions versus full consumption emissions, differences between greenhouse gases, etc., do you think another metric or concept could be more useful in driving the systemic change we need? As you know, most of the existing net zero definitions and policies are based on territorial emissions, which risks underestimating the real climate impacts and diluting ambition for countries like the UK with large net import of goods, including food.
I can take this one. That's a question that really resonates with me. I used to work on consumption emissions within DEFRA, and the UK government is one of the only governments that uses consumption emissions. But when I say consumption emissions, we just monitor them. They don't drive, they don't inform any policies, because there is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that sets the sort of frameworks for how individual states monitor, report and verify emissions, which is through the territorial model. But it's a completely different set of questions once you start to think about consumptions, which is your territorial plus your non-territorial, i.e. your international emissions. And that's a lot more complex, but that is exactly what we should be looking at, because it allows and enables us to look at our international, the implications of our kind of economies and societies internationally as well. We tried to do that to the extent possible in the group, but it's a lot more complex, but it's a lot more just, and we played around with the terminology of real net zero, which that is a whole lot closer to. And yeah, it is real net zero. It enables you to look at the holistic implications of your society and economy, the worldwide. And again, talking about low-lying fruit, a lot of the West Europe's emissions have been reduced as a result of offshoring our production and our emissions, whether that be for food or heavy industry, for example. So yeah, it does need to be consumption emissions, in my view, and it's not something that gets a whole lot of airtime, because we as an ecosystem of people are kind of stuck with the norm of territorial emissions.
Yes, I mean, we actually kind of use the sort of three most used definitions net zero and put them all in the report. But I think it's sometimes very kind of like very easy in a way to think, well, if we change the definition, we could change an outcome. And I think that you know, if we started looking at undoing the Climate Change Act, we could have an outcome we didn't want at all. And I think that is the sort of always the tension politically. So I'm kind of like somebody who always works with the, you know, unless it's so awful that it's delivering us completely appalling outcomes, can we work with something in order to deliver better outcomes? So I think that there could definitely be better metrics, but whether we could get any government at the moment to engage with better metrics might be problematic. So we very much, you know, used all the definitions with a kind of emphasis on the definitions, the UN definition that kind of focused on also on the idea of nature being firmly in the mix, rather than just looking at the kind of consumption areas. But I do think it's in the context of the big missing link for me at the moment is the fact that, and Tim Lang's report highlights this completely, and so did the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, is that actually, because of the big focus on mitigation, we're not doing enough on adaptation. And actually there is a real danger for our poorest communities who will lose access. I mean, don't want to sound doomist about this, but you know, I think government has an absolute duty to look after its populations, and therefore an absolute duty that when it has the evidence to say it needs to take action, then what we don't want is our poorest communities to be removed from insurance, to be flooded, to have wildfire issues, to be damaged by storms, etc. So we have got a duty on government that I think we all need to be asking government to take on more effectively.
Thank you, Jane. I think the next question, Stan already answered in the chat. Is there anything you'd like to develop on that question?
Yeah, brilliant question. I think what Sarah's sort of speaking to is perhaps the space between our practice and I guess the theory and wider messages to Welsh Government. So we did what we could with the resources available to us when that comes to sort of meaningful involvement and engagement of the public of Wales, whether they were stakeholders or the public, using the example of kind of vision development. We did that with a select proportion of the food system within Wales, but for this work to be just and proper, all of those kind of messages need to be translated into kind of systemic practice by Welsh Government. We haven't spoken to it too much, but our enablers chapter covers quite a lot of what the I guess methods could look like to kind of achieve that. Like when we talk about involvement, what does that look like across the entire society of Wales? And something we couldn't make happen, but was a big piece of advice back to Welsh Government, was this idea of kind of having systemic citizens' assemblies and sort of treating it quite akin to a kind of climate jury. In the public of Wales will have the opportunity at different levels, depending on what the policy is, whether that be national, regional, sub-regional, or more local than that, to be fully involved in the decision making around kind of climate, environment, etc., sustainable development policy. And yeah, they would be financially rewarded for their time. So there's not a cost opportunity. They'd be given a proper amount of time. They would also have time with experts, because it's very hard to understand the deep kind of expert substance if you're not an expert. And there's also a high number of groups kind of filling that void, quote unquote GB News, for example. So there's quite, I guess what I'm saying is there's quite a lot of the answer to the difference between our practice and a sort of bigger implementation of that. Like what we are able to do with our resources, what really needs to be done is kind of on that enablers chapter, particularly the involvement of the public in Wales through kind of more systemic citizens' assemblies. Yeah, it's a brilliant question, and it's fascinating because I've come across that in government quite a lot, in that there's some bigger things you need to practice, but you're ultimately constrained by your budget, so you can't practice it as well as you would like, but you know that's what you really need to do, and it's a big thing to speak to. But particularly the citizens' assemblies, I think, has huge potential to fill that gap in a very different way to there is at the moment.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I'd add, and it is, I think it's kind of the question in a way, because of the fact that what we're trying to do is not do a series of recommendations. So when you know, the reports were published, of course, you know, somebody of course then totted up all the actions and said there's something like 166 separate actions, and I kind of said, please don't miss the point on this, because these are not separate actions. This is about cohesive action which will make Wales safer, and we hope would make other countries safer if they followed in this route. And I think the really important kind of like aspect to that is that if we have just so many recommendations that another report sits on the shelf, and then politicians and civil servants, you know, will actually start picking up something that they can really work with. And what we want to try and help people think their space into is that actually delivery pathways signed up by more than one party that could deliver over a period of change of administration in government is actually the safest way in terms of taking action. And if we can help governments have such tools at their disposal, then actually we help there to be a better dialogue around these areas. Stan.
Diolch, Jane, and thank you everyone for listening. I put my email in the chat if anyone would like to follow up. Whilst Jane and I are not formally in this group anymore, you will be unsurprised to know we are still politicking and working behind the scenes to make sure that this work does have a future, because it's very important to us. And yeah, I guess picking up on that sort of positivity thing, because I assume I'm talking to a lot of people doing really interesting work in there. The thing I've been thinking about a lot recently, given the sort of wider landscape of challenges we now find ourselves in, this does feel like a bit of a pivot in history, particularly for the climate, environment, and social justice movement, is to practice perseverance as a passion. If there's anything I've learned from bashing my head against the desks of politicians and civil servants, it's to stick in there and practice your perseverance as a passion, and not to be too disheartened by the things we can't control, but to, yeah, stick to it and be steadfast as a movement and ecosystem of people that are working towards something bigger than themselves.